Hey, what's up everybody? It's your boy Tristan Barracks here, and I'm super excited about today's topic where we'll be talking about how to make your footage look super cinematic. Let's go! Woo! Tip number one for making your footage look more cinematic: shoot in 24 frames per second. There's a lot of ways of shooting film. You can shoot in 24 frames, you can shoot in 30 frames, you can shoot in 60 frames, you can shoot in 120 frames, you can shoot pretty much any frame rate you want on most cameras now. There's so many options out there, but the reason why I chose 24 frames per second is because that is the industry standard for cinematic films. Now, when you go to the movies and you watch a beautifully shot cinematic film and the aesthetic looks so beautiful, the reason why the aesthetic looks so amazing and so creamy and crispy is because it's shot in 24 frames per second. There's a certain aesthetic appeal that comes with shooting 24 frames per second. This is a standard that has stood the test of time. 24 frames is the industry standard and it gives a certain aesthetic. Now, if you bump yourself up to 30 frames per second, then you're going into more of standard HD TV signal and imagery. So for instance, the 30 frames per second sort of aesthetic is something that you would see if you're watching a hockey game or an NFL game, or if you're watching the live local news in your city. 30 frames per second is pretty much more of a TV standard, and that gives you more of a broadcasty live feel, whereas 24 frames per second gives you more of that cinematic, more of that dreamy, sort of Hollywood feel. And that's why I recommend using 24 frames as one of the first things that you can do to make your footage look ultra cinematic. My second tip for making your video footage look ultra cinematic is have steady footage. I cannot tell you how simple but how effective this particular point is. Just having your footage shot steady, stable, on a tripod, on a monopod will make a world of a difference. There's nothing that can replace the effectiveness of putting your camera on a stable surface, whether it's on a tabletop, whether it's connected to a tripod or a monopod. When you have stable footage, it allows the viewer to not be distracted by the rock and the shape of the footage and to be immersed in the story that you're trying to tell. So please, please, please have stable footage, super stable footage, like hard rock, hard abs, stable footage. Like don't play, don't mess around with me, stable footage. Like, yo, I'm gonna get my boys if you don't have stable footage type of thing. You feel me? All right, cool. My third tip for making your footage look more cinematic is use a little bit of movement. Now, what I mean by that is, I'm not saying rock it around, rock the camera around, but use things like sliders, like gimbals, like cranes, like glide cams, and even drones to give cinematic, sweet movement. I love using sliders because I can get some dollying shots. And when I say dollying shots, I just mean slowly going in, slowly coming out, slowly going left, slowly going right. And all of these subtle movements create this level of polish that just adds to your story. One of the things that you want to do is you want to understand the rules like stability, and then you want to be able to understand the complementary rules like movement. Movement can really give an immersive experience for the viewer. It can also create dynamics to the storyline that will help drive the narrative. So the next time that you're shooting, think about a way to move the camera in a very subtle but steady and cool way. Maybe a slider, maybe a gimbal, maybe both, maybe a drone. My fourth tip for making your footage look more cinematic is color grade your video. I cannot tell you how many people do not color grade their video footage. I mean, again, it's a simple thing. It's not something that's super difficult to do. You can buy a packet of LUTs. You can just bump up your shadows so they're a little bit more grayer instead of ultra black. You can add a punch of color. You can create a certain look, a certain feel, a certain tone. You can turn it into black and white. You can do so much things with color to make your footage more cinematic. There's no excuse for not color grading your footage. And here's the thing, there's tons of information out there. You can go on YouTube, you can go on Vimeo, you can check out all types of video content that will teach you how to color correct your footage and make it look more cinematic, make it look sweet, buttery, crispy and creamy, and ready to present to your audience. The last way you can make your footage look more cinematic is by using film grain. Now, film grain is basically a filter or an effect or a video clip that emulates actual film aesthetic. So back in the day when the movie industry used film and not digital cameras, there was a different aesthetic for the different types of film stocks that you would use. So for instance, if you use 16 millimeter versus 8 versus 35 versus, full frame, there were different types of film stocks. There was Kodak, there was Fuji. Some had more grain, some had less grain, some had more saturation, some had less saturation. So when I talk about adding film grain, what I'm actually asking you to do is to emulate the original way film looked or movies looked. They had grain in them, just little particles that were on top of the image that just made it look even more cinematic. So one of the best plugins I love using for emulating film grain is Filmconvert. Filmconvert actually kind of does color correction and it does film conversion or film emulation. And it's a super dope plugin. It's worth every penny that you're gonna spend on it, and it makes your workflow a lot easier. The other way that you can do it is you can actually buy clips from different websites like Gorilla Grain or Cinegrain, and what they'll do is they'll sell you a package of different film aesthetics, film clips that you put on top of your actual movie that will emulate that stock of film footage. So that way it actually looks like there's actual grain on top of your digital footage. And it's a super easy way of making your footage look ultra cinematic. Well, that's the end of another episode of Cinecut with your host, me, Tristan Barracks. I hope you laughed out loud and learned something too. Until the next time, stay cool, stay creative. Peace!